So, while today's lecture is called The Politics of Means and Methods, an arena in which we began to think about the politics of building architecture, I'm woefully aware of the fraught political times in which we're living, something that has been buried for many years, but has been alive and unwell for many decades, if not centuries, demonstrating to us all of the ways in which architecture and urbanism is implicated in social processes that are political at their core. Gerrymandering, redlining, all of these strategies are deeply architectural in my mind, and come to bear on a lecture that, while I begin with the legal framework to describe means and methods, is always comes back to connect what the means and methods has to do with the public domain, or certain ethical dimensions of who does what in architecture, certain moral predicaments one gets into, and ultimately what the agency of the architect is. For those of you in practice, this discussion about means and methods is almost banal, and yet for me it was scandalous some 20, 25 years ago when I entered into practice, discovering that the architect is only responsible for design intent, while the contractor assumes the responsibility for how something is built. And in my mind, given the kind of work that we were doing, essentially alienates the very design authorship that you have in your mind from its protocols of construction. And that schism effectively distances the architect from labor and from all the aspects of architectural detailing that one effectively invests in one's lifetime. As an anecdote, and this goes back to the Office DA days, when we got the Mantra Commission, effectively one of our first commercial commissions, we had a budget of about $230,000, within which we wanted to build what is called the hookah den, which was priced by the contractor at $200,000, leaving about $30,000 to be spent on the rest of the 6,000 square feet. And we realized, this is when I was working with Monica, right then and there, that something must be wrong, that some little pavilion like this may cost $200,000. So together we figured out the drawing set, printed it out at full scale, hung plumb bobs from the ceiling, suspended it down, and began to glue and screw various slats of wood, realizing that we could probably build 7 layers a day, completing it in about 30 days for $30,000 with a slight profit, and leave about $200,000 for the rest of the 6,000 square feet that we had in mind. And that was our entry into practice. The discovery of agency and the connection of not only architecture to construction, but effectively architecture to the history and agency of construction in the ways that one could and should theorize it. To that end, the generative detail is a key point of many of the projects that we start with. Instead of designing from top down, often we will investigate the DNA of a material or a means and methods of how it's built. In this case, rebar, to develop a bridge that connects the Yarra River to the tennis grounds of Melbourne, a pedestrian bridge whose presence is much more from its underbelly than the actual surface on which you walk, asking ourselves what would it mean to develop a structural filigree whose logic is all about the redundancy that one could achieve by building many small elements, foregoing that traditional dialectical relationship between structure and skin, if you will, or major metal chords and adornment. And so we looked at ways in which the maximum moment could be embodied over the length of this filigree, while the wrappings underneath would reinforce it, wrapping up over the rails, the guards, and effectively creating the lights from which one spoke to the skyline of Melbourne. This is effectively a folly, but it also recognizes that the bridge is only really occupied 12 days a year, with the majority of the year the park being activated from underneath and giving this reflected ceiling plan really the dominant voice in the project. You will see this theme of the reflected ceiling plan, what I call the sixth elevation, in several junctures of this talk. But going back to figurative and configurative thinking, we lean towards the right, where we're working with kernels of material, with details, aggregating them to arrive at figures of architecture. While the nest and the bowl are in many ways the same thing, one is thought top down and the other one bottom up. The nest, as you well know, can produce many other configurations rather than what we see here. And our research really tries to push the parameters of working configuratively. As was mentioned earlier, the last time I was here was in 2008, right while we were doing about 12, 13 competitions, of which we won 3. What made us survive effectively as a firm. It so happened that those 3 projects were schools of architecture: Georgia Tech, Melbourne School of Design, and the Daniels faculty on the right. The sixth elevation, the reflected ceiling plan, evolved for us as the critical site of architecture, recognizing that the domes of the Renaissance and their challenge to structure and light has been effectively taken over by the majority of what we call the infrastructure of architecture, from sprinkler systems to lighting and mechanical systems, diffusers, all of which are not only difficult to house, but composed of consultancies that never actually want to collaborate with designers. And so much of our earlier work, before we went to the larger scale, were strategic engagements with the idea of designing upside down, designing from the ceiling down, in this case, the Bank Restaurant, a project that finds its figure in relationship to the haphazard structures, mechanical systems, and programs that are suspended from the ceiling, made seamlessly intertwined here and revealed on the lateral axis as one looks up into the infrastructure. For the Melbourne School of Design, we were charged with the design of a design studio, a space that school had never had, an academic environment which was interdisciplinary, a living building that was green and ecological in its thinking, and built pedagogy by not only creating a space where teaching and learning happens, but that the building itself should have a didactic function. within the context of the campus of Melbourne, this takes place at its core around several of the Neo-Georgian courts, itself such a deep building, a mat building, that itself requires a court in the middle, framed by a ceiling, a sixth elevation, if you will, that in effect resuscitates the project by creating a studio hall. The project, strangely, was budgeted with the studios, but after very close programming, we realized it couldn't afford the studio space at the top of the building. And so our task was to find clever ways in which the public space of this building could be transformed into the studio space itself by expanding the corridors from 5 to about 10 feet, and then situating different hot desks and places of occupation to be adjacent to research, to studios, to exhibit spaces, so that they could take over the rest of the building when they were not scheduled with other events, effectively making the entire building a studio space. And then categorically eliminating those things that we call railings and substituting them with an exhibit space at the bottom, and then a series of collaborative model making spaces at the first floor, and then drafting counters on the second floor, and then finally crit spaces on the top floor. In a way, enforcing the idea that people from architecture, urbanism, and landscape would invariably be going up and down the building to engage with each other. As a piece of urbanism, it's a robust building, connecting to the main commercial drag and the administrative building on the south, connecting to the Elizabeth Murdoch building to the east, and the engineering building to the northeast. The loading happening to the north with the Fab Lab opening up onto that area, as well as the concrete lawn, the main quad of the campus, being connected and resuscitating the Joseph Reed facade. And so while the entire campus goes through the base of this building as part of its urban promenade, a new piano nobile is built one floor up that becomes a new ground for the studio and becomes revealed as one is walking through there, inclusive of 3 dedicated studios for the visiting critics, the topic of this lecture. And so the revelation of this space produces this iconic element within the center that departs from the very precedents that you see here, in that the ceiling is the generative seed by which the studios are given form, with LVLs that span 22 meters and lateral bracing that block the direct sunlight but give daylight into the space. There are deep wooden members that are about 3 meters deep that are slung in suspension down 3 stories but never touching the ground. And so it's an inverted tectonic where the massive members become thin, as thin as plywood by the time they come to the bottom, and are suspended in tension. And so if the classical building is built on the notion of rustication and massive stones at the base, this is doing exactly the opposite. And at the top of the building, one gets a sense of this levity, the sheer weight and the emphasis of the roof as one sees it against the light. Now, from a construction point of view and our ability to tap into the local possibilities that Melbourne brought to us, we realized that we could tap into the precast industry, the wood industry, and build about 80% of the building off-site. And such was the case with the roof that was all installed in less than 3 weeks, with the coffering coming onto the site at 4 or 5 o'clock in the mornings, missing the traffic, and then getting placed up there into the suspended studio, a kind of occupiable truss in and of itself. And then as one goes down the stairs and ramps, connecting all of the social and working spaces, one recognizes that at the bottom, the veneers of that same structure are revealed on edge as they become acoustic baffles, framing the lighting and the sprinkler systems underneath, themselves perforated for acoustic mitigation within that space. It was to be the new home for the School of Architecture, and it's conceptualized as a precious space that would be inhabitable 24/7, because they didn't actually have dedicated studio spaces. It's a hot space, essentially. And lo and behold, it actually became so successful for the rest of the university. It became a kind of social hall where everybody hung out, disallowing the very designers to use the space. And so this brings to it a kind of public dimension we had ourselves had not anticipated. But as we built that, and as we strategized other projects, the tension between the isolated process of designing something at your desk and your engagement with building trades and sub-trades never aligns temporally the way that you want to. And so sometimes the material ethics that one wants to build with transform, and often to the detriment or to the death of project. And so our flexibility was really tested in the Daniels faculty, in the center of Spadina Circle, in the southwest corner of the University of Toronto campus, where Knox College finds itself a neo-Gothic building of some 150 years old, required a studio space to its north, and indeed a new address, a north facade, from which we could build a landscape where additions and urban spaces could be carved, respecting the existing spire and activating the urban realm, recalling that this is not only a school of architecture, but of urbanism and landscape, effectively engaging all of the disciplines to make what is a dangerous roundabout a place of occupation. The Knox College is relatively simple from an organizational point of view, a U-shaped building that for reasons of economy, we needed to keep compact. And by doing so, effectively complete a latent circulation within it, create the northern address, implant the cores and the main infrastructure on the corners, and then take the existing courtyard and transform it into the Great Hall. A great hall for large lectures and classes as it becomes divided into pieces. And this dark room at its core borrows light from all of its neighboring spaces, something I'll try to develop in a moment. While the symbolic axis of the building is north-south, its effective practical access is east-west. And so people walk through a pedestrian street, it's open 24/7, and begin to get peeks up towards Spadina North while engaging in the cafe, the lecture hall, and many of the other public functions, including the library, that are accessible from this space. But the building monolithic as it is in fact conceptualized as a landscape building with all of its critical spaces extending out towards the circle. So the Fab Lab has a construction court outside, the street extends to the campus, and Knox College extends to the South Terrace. And the activation of this street is open 24/7 so that other portions of the buildings may lock down, but that one can still gain the kind of porosity to see up into the studios and beyond into the urban realm. Here looking down from the street towards the Fab Lab, going outside and looking back in where work happens indoors and outdoors, and then in turn connects back to the city. The building hardly has no windows except for this northern light, which acts as a kind of great ambient light for the studio spaces above. But here then comes the dilemma, the predicament. As designed, a surface active structural system conceived of for the roof to span 100 and some odd feet in order to forego structural systems or drainage systems within the core of the building and maintain the kind of flexibility of reorganization for the studio spaces. Indeed, they told us that this is not buildable, and we kept going back to them and saying that there are great precedents for these kind of folded structures. And as we went around several times, they eventually succumbed to our argument, but then said it was $1 million over budget. And of course, it was hard for us to do what we did in Mantra on this occasion. We couldn't actually build the dome or the vaults ourselves. But what we could do is build one of them. And so that is what we did in our workshop. First, we demonstrated to them that a ruled surface by definition is developable, and therefore we could not only use it as a basis for sheetrock, but actually a sheetrock that is has a radiant panel set within it, such that the heating would come from the ground up, but the cooling would come from the ceiling down, and demonstrating to them that we could save somewhere in the neighborhood of $800,000 by using a metal system to build a low resolution version of this. And indeed, that is what happened after the building of this mock-up. And so the mock-up became a political tool, a mechanism for warfare, if you like, for a contractor who was not going there with us. The actual construction process then became quite simple. As you can see, the ruling of these surfaces with the radiant panels being inset, subsequently painted, and embodying the promise of the building and its sustainable agendas. I'm not going to speak to that right now, though it is an obvious element that resides behind all of these projects that I'm going to talk about tonight, and we can certainly talk about that later. But this sixth elevation in many ways is the project. The project is designed from the top, and then it oozes the light down. And it's a moment in which the structural system, the daylighting, and the hydrology of the scheme are coming into confluence as that water is essentially channeled into a reveal between the old and the new building, held within cisterns, and then sort of diffused in the landscape of Spadina Circle. Now, with all of the control that one can gain in the context of direct patronage with a single client, or even in the controlled environment of an institution, in the public process, the prospect of architectural control becomes quite vulnerable. And that was the lesson that we learned in engaging a true political process of participatory design for the Adams Library, where our team worked for over 1 year merely in the planning process that produced a plan that we ourselves would not have known how to design this way, but that were led there in some way through collaboration and through listening to this delicate site in Dorchester. Now, from a simple point of view, though the plan doesn't have a clear parti, it is a matte building, again, that is far and wide. It is zoned into 3 segments, one for adults, one for adolescents, and one for children, each of which have their own wing and orientation, centered around a control desk that is on axis with the main door where the control happens. And anybody who's dealt with libraries or has designed one understands that diagram to be, at least for now, in the age of physical books, the core of the kind of panoptic model around which it operates. But the building takes on several other dimensions as we come to design it. And so I'll try to explain the diagram to you and how we conceptualized it. Monumental and civic on the main street, it establishes the primacy of a large pediment in contrast to the rear, where the residential units of the houses are broken down into small pitches, connecting the two and allowing the water to all come into an alleyway where the water is mitigated, allowing southern sun to come into the core of the building from the south while framing an existing oak tree to the north. If the library shelving and seating is oriented north-south, the beams in contrast are oriented east-west in a kind of plaid fashion and become the embodiment of that 6th elevation. And as one goes through the building, one witnesses that topography overhead in one's navigation towards the oak court. The library needs to be on one floor, and so the presence of that ceiling is also mirrored by a roof that is visible from all of the triple deckers in the neighborhood, being somewhat low as a building and having a topography that is visible as a kind of new ground from all of the other buildings. With the necessity of being maintenance free, we were restricted to either using stone or some other material as such, and we discovered certain terracotta panel products that could effectively produce a relief such that it would absorb the shadows and the light in a seductive way, amplifying the civic realm of the main street with transparent facade that reveals that ceiling, but also in articulating the urban passage to the east with the scuppers. Indeed, the scuppers are the dimension of the roof itself, and a promenade that gives you a shortcut from the main street on one side to the high school and the neighborhood on the other. From the south, slight awnings that control the direct sunlight in the summer months, while extending direct sun into the core of the building at winter times for natural heating, and then adopting a pragmatic approach to the facade, something that is deeply part of Yankee culture, if you like. And this notion that the budget can only take you so far. So you may have stone on the front facade, brick on the side, and wood in the back, in what is called these brick-sided structures. And we realize that this symbolic form of pragmatism may become a mechanism for us to effectively work with raw terracotta, with white terracotta, and aubergine to create a very dark set of areas that are articulated for the building. And this building is a couple months away from completion, with the idea that, much like the bank restaurant that I showed earlier, everything will be exposed with a kind of darkened reveal that one will see in between the beams. I spoke earlier about designing top-down or bottom-up, and there are moments in which our predisposition towards material operations is not accessible in the first instance. And so the house in southern France was one of those conditions in which we had an extraordinary site with amazing views, but in a suburban condition that one would want to protect oneself from in order to have the level of privacy that such a property would necessitate. So being on the side of a hill, we developed a strategy of a courtyard that's a slipped courtyard, protecting the public aspects of the house on the upper level with two wings, and nesting the bedrooms below, looking back into the swimming pool. And so diagrammatically, the property helps to distort and deform the house, the views with the panoramic on one side and framed views on the other. The internalized view of the court gives way to an asymmetrical opening up to the panorama. Being separated on two corners, staircases are nested in two corners, connecting the two, while the roof opens itself up to the views towards the west, but also allowing the landscape to leak into the courtyard from the point of view of arrival. The building then is at once in dialogue with its landscape, and much of the landscape is dedicated to the existing groves of trees and fruit trees and olive groves and so forth, but bringing you up into that space, not the front door. This is the landscape connection. We draw you in to a nested space which is completely private and yet completely open to the view of the house towards the Mediterranean. The actual plan shows the living room and the master suite on the top floor, while giving access to the landscape directly from it. The actual front door is a penetration on this cantilevered beam, what we just saw earlier on. And the access into the house gives way to effectively what is akin to a case study house, a glass box on one side that, in effect, much like the way that a Kimball Art Museum would span the long way, we begin to realize that the ceiling structure of this is spanning as much the long way as it is laterally, opening up to the western light, the views towards the Pinus Pinei, but also cross drafts that are a center part of how natural ventilation works there. Here you can see the majesty of these trees soaring some 50 feet, 60 feet overhead. And so the reframing of those views towards that site are a central part of the organization of this house. And the reflected ceiling plan, the folding of that plan, of that ceiling, is very much dedicated to the ways in which the roof is all channeling the water to one side. Now, if it's not clear also that the edge of the swimming pool, in fact, is a retaining wall that serves as a beam that holds the front facade in place. And so in the master suite, one is effectively inhabiting a structural system. And down below that, one is penetrating that same wall, looking back into the pool. And so the house gains light to two forms of light. One is the warmth of the eastern sunrise, and the other one is the coolness of the swimming pool coming from the opposite direction. And then the layering of the house has it that there are several systems that are working in tandem with each other, both for privacy, the curtains, the glazing for environmental separation, the wood, both as security as well as for lighting, and finally drawing it all back for a seamless access back out into the landscape. But the way in which we had conceptualized this originally, and something that was never able to be realized, is part of the narrative that I wanted to share with you, because effectively much of our research has to do with these kinds of games that are transported from one project to the other. It was the first time that we were dealing with concrete, which, very dissimilar to our other projects, is not composed of aggregate compositions of blocks or shingles or slabs and so forth. And so the expression of concrete, strangely enough, is the result of a liquid medium whose formwork produces that expression, or whose bush hammering and post-production work gives it that kind of shade and shadow. And so we tested out fabric-formed renditions of a smooth concrete facade that would become rusticated as you go inside, to test out the expressive means that this could take on. And though seductive as an animation, we found it too rhetorical and did not pursue it. But the second strategy went along with similar lines, except in this case we were working with the actual aggregate that you pour into the concrete, smooth on the inside, but with incrementally larger pieces of aggregate as you place panels of concrete walls, to the point that when you're in the landscape, the concrete is merely just the mortar holding a stone wall together. That is the common trope that delineates and describes the properties of southern France. And so here is a moment where the concrete and the stone walls establish a kind of rapport and a dialogue with each other through the medium itself. And I think you've seen Frank Lloyd Wright and Moneo doing such things at a much larger scale. Alas, at the end, we were only able to work with the aggregate of the earth down there itself, which is a deep reddish amber, which is beautiful in and of itself. And so the operations that we were left with effectively had to do with the sandblasting of those studs to radicalize the expression of the wood that is a kind of innate part of the pour, demonstrating to us what is it that in a way that architects do. What I call the tectonic brain has to not so much to do with what is natural. It's only when I change the slide that you realize what is wrong with this particular one, because we all know that the stripes of the zebra go perpendicular not only to the torso but also to the legs, and the architecture happens strangely at the juncture as one navigates from one to the other. But what we do as architects often has to do with the artificial imposition of grains as we discover the directionality of beams, of floors, of shelving systems. All that is architectural and how it bears on us. So now, just simply as a postscript, I will just end by saying that if we've spent about 30 years in practice, 20 of it was spent in the elaboration of ideas, and more often than not, an additive process, almost to excess. The last 10 years, on the other hand, have been a subtractive one, in an attempt to try to eliminate trades, eliminate materials, and if you like, do a bit of intellectual value engineering across the process. So these last two anecdotes really have to do with these projects that are raw and exposed and deliver a kind of dumbness that I would want some of the older projects to have arrived at also. Here, for the dormitory at the Rhode Island School of Design, we were not allowed to develop a building that was green per se, because we could not, well, I'm saying a LEED building, but we were asked, what would you do if you were given the platform to pursue something that is deeply sustainable in some way or another? And so we realized that we would gain a lot simply by considering mass timber. We discovered through that process, though, that one can't be a purist about it, because the beams, if they had remained in wood, would have not been penetrable by the mechanical systems, thus pushing the building higher and higher, becoming too high for the context and too expensive. And so the hybrid system of the steel and the CLT produced a circumstance in which the best of these two worlds would work together and radically change the economies of this building. The structure of this building in its entirety was erected in less than 3 weeks. And its expression is completely independent of it, as it begins to speak to the urbanism of Providence itself. In that same vein, we are now working with a wooden building, again, cross-laminated timber and plywood, to extend another history in which we're very much interested. Here, a project that speaks as much to Kahn as it does to Jorge Silvetti, and a recollection of the castle in Headingham, whereby the peripheral spaces of a structure may radicalize its programmability. In our structure, dimension completely different than both of these, we have a room that is 16 by 16 on all levels, with almost identical plans on every level, brought together by a single stair whose underneath and whose overhead are always programmable by beds, showers, toilets, closets, and all that belongs in a poche. The plan is almost always identical, with closets and a kitchenette to one side, a master bed in the center with shelving behind it, a window on axis, in this case towards the west, but we have the same bedroom pointing north and east, as well as the poché spaces on the sides, which is where the other programs reside when the stair is not. The magic of this particular building has to do with the idea that the structural envelope of the building is on the outside, the CLT, and therefore that gains the waterproofing and insulation without any mechanical functions to serve, because all of those are housed in the inner wall, which is a hollow wall where essentially ducts, wiring, and plumbing all go. And that this house would not be able to work were it not for this double ring that worked in tandem. And so here you can see also the relationship between a cladding system, a kind of clapboard system that is over 18 inches deep, with one large window per elevation, as well as these small slots that are excavations from the clapboard that sort of are for cross ventilation or into the showers and the toilets. As I said before, the poché spaces being nested above and below those extraneous spaces. And the inhabitable liminal space that is not in the main room is the payback that one gets in this building. And finally, of course, the living room and the destination at the top. So with that, I thank you very much, and I hope we can now begin to speak a little bit more about the different implications of the direct politics of construction as it deals with other aspects that it impinges on along the way. Thanks so much.